Well, good afternoon or good morning or good day, wherever you happen to be. I am John Sangenberger, and I am honored to lead the Alumni Relations Office here at the Tepper School. We're so glad to welcome you to our virtual classroom today at the Tepper School on managing remote work and building collective intelligence in the workplace. We're always happy to have you participate in our Alumni Lifelong Learning program at the school, and we're glad to have alumni from across this campus joining us today. Before we begin, I'd like to do a couple of quick announcements for us. First of all, our upcoming webinar. We have a faculty dialogue with CMU coming up next week on navigating the intelligent future, business and beyond. It includes not only our Dean Isabel Beju, but also three of our outstanding faculty members, Taiwan Kim, R. Ravi, and Ariel Zetlin Jones. So you'll mark your calendars for that. It's going to be an outstanding discussion as well. We also are beginning our fall events, in-person events again. We've already had a couple of them in New York and in Pittsburgh, but we're taking our Dean on the road for the Intelligent Future. And we are going to be in London, Paris, Madrid, Singapore, back in the US at Washington, DC, Delhi and Mumbai in India in December. We also have some Carnegie Mellon receptions that are going to be coming up. You'll hear about them soon, but November 14th in New York and December 1st in Pittsburgh. This is in addition to some of our happy hours and other activities we'll be doing, but it's so good to be able to get out and see our alumni in person again. We also want you to save the date for Reunion 2023. Our Tepper Alumni Reunion is going to be celebrating, of course, all alumni are welcome, but special celebrations for those whose class graduation year is a 3-year and 8, as well as our class of 2022 coming back for their 1-year reunion. We're just starting getting our alumni volunteers together, and we've got some calls and things planned for October. So if you're interested in participating in your class reunion, please let us know. We're eager to have you with us. It's going to be an incredible celebration in the spring here on campus. We also appreciate your support of Carnegie Mellon University and the school. It's your support that helps us accomplish the academic mission of the university, as well as provide opportunities like today for our alumni community. CMU Giving Day comes up in November, and we hope you'll be thinking about giving back to your alma mater now or hopefully in November. Now, let me introduce our outstanding speakers for today. They're award-winning faculty members here at the Tepper School. First is Anita Williams Woolley. She is Associate Dean now for research here at the school, in addition to being Professor of Organizational Behavior and Theory. She received her PhD from Harvard University, where she also attended for her bachelor's and master's. She joined the Tepper School in 2008 and teaches MBA and executive education courses on managing people and teams and organizations. As you can see, she's an award-winning scholar, and her work on team collaboration, collective intelligence, and managing team memberships has been published in many of the leading magazines. She'll also be talking about that today. She's also served on the editorial boards for a number of important organizations and is a member of the Academy of Management, the Interdisciplinary Network Group for Group Research, and the Association for Psychological Science. So glad to have you with us, Professor Woolley. And leading our discussion today, and as our moderator, is going to be Professor Andrew Lee. He's Assistant Professor of Operations Research here at the Tepper School. He earned his BS in Operations Research and Applied Mathematics from Columbia and his PhD in Operations Research from MIT. He joined the Tepper faculty 5 years ago, almost 5 years ago in 2018, and has been very active with us. You're going to hear about statistics, optimization, machine learning, and all the things that he's interested in, and particularly some of his work that he's doing in the medical area. He serves as a co-leader of Enable, or CMU Retail and Service Collaborative. He'll talk a little bit about that today. And he also now heads our business analytics track. So very happy today to be able to introduce you to two amazing professors, and I'm going to hand it over to them for our discussion. Professors?
Thanks, John. And thank you to everybody here kind of in attendance. Look, the plan today is to hit on very real questions related to work and teams in general, work and kind of the hybrid and remote age. we thought a bit about how to structure this event. We have Anita here, who is essentially the world expert in all of this, and we were debating kind of, Anita takes a very principled academic approach to answering these questions, and so we had to kind of decide on the right way to balance questions asked by, for example, me, a non-expert, and fundamental principles taught by Anita. And so the structure that we've decided on that we'll go with is that, so Anita will present first for about like 10-ish minutes, just to kind of establish, I think, again, principles and a language, and then we'll go from there. I'll kind of take, I have my own questions. Some of you that registered have already given questions. We've read all of those, and those will be incorporated. And there is a Q&A function in this Zoom event. We are seeing all of those questions too. So at any moment, please feel free to put questions there. There won't be kind of a divide between my questions and kind of your questions. We're reading all of those live. Okay, so at any moment, feel free to ask your questions through that feature. In any case, without kind of further ado, I'll let Anita start us off with her first, the part one, the presentation.
Thanks. Hi. Well, I'm happy to be here with you. And as Andrew explained, we thought maybe we'll start off by just giving a little bit of background on collective intelligence, including some of the things that we've started to think about related to remote work. But certainly, I think there are a lot of different aspects of that we could address depending on your questions and your interests. And so we'll just sort of whet your appetite and see where it goes from there. So here is, hopefully you're seeing slides now. Our work on, thank you, collective intelligence. And so, just again, kind of starting from where we started, we, for a long time in the field of teams research, when we thought about intelligence in teams, we thought about it as a function of the individuals on the team. And so prime example, around the time I was starting my career was about the time of the September 11th attacks. And one thing among the many things that was stunning about those attacks was the discovery eventually that the fact that they even occurred could be attributed to a failure of collaboration. That, in fact, the intelligence community knew everything they needed to know to prevent those attacks from happening, but they failed to sort of integrate that information and connect the dots, as the phrase came to be known. And so, but one of the leading hypotheses about this failure was that, well, maybe we just lack expertise in the community. Maybe we just don't have deep enough subject matter expertise. And so that inspired some research by my collaborators. At the time, I was doing a postdoc with Richard Hackman, who was an advisor to the director of the CIA. And so we were working on this issue of what are the issues underlying the lack of collaboration and collective intelligence in the intelligence community. Double entendre here with intelligence, right? So one of the studies we ran, we created teams of either experts or non-experts and gave them a terrorism scenario, one that we knew the answer to, but we gave them our scenario and asked them to do an analysis and come up with what they thought was going on. And so the generalists, what we found was that they kind of got some things right, but they missed some things. There was some data that they didn't, quite know how to analyze. And so that's where, our subject matter experts came in. And so we thought, okay, well, they'll probably do better, but it turned out they did significantly worse. And as we dug into it, it set us on a different path to thinking about intelligence differently in the team context. Rather than thinking about intelligent teams as being made up of just smart people, it seemed that there was a separate factor that was really capturing how well the team itself worked together, how well it made use of the individual abilities that it had available, or the opportunities or the resources. And so we created a collective intelligence test, which is sort of like an individual intelligence test, but includes problems that teams work on together. So, and we sample a variety of different kinds of tasks, things that in the literature, we would have thought that different teams would be best at, but we found that the same teams tended to perform at a high level across all of our tasks in our test. And furthermore, when we had these collective intelligence scores, we could better predict how those teams would perform in the future, even better than knowing the average or maximum intelligence of individual members. So there's something about how the team was working together that was important. And so from there, we really have been focusing on, well, what is it that shapes collective intelligence? How can we lay the foundation for more teams to be collectively intelligent? And so there are kind of three building blocks, if you will, that have come up over and over again in our research. One relates to having the right people, not only about individual intelligence, but some other attributes, and I'm just going to name a couple in this overview. A second has to do with goal setting, and a third has to do with how they're set up to coordinate. And so in the individual having the right people category, one thing that comes up over and over again is social intelligence. There are some individuals who are very good at picking up on subtle cues and using that information to facilitate social interaction. And when teams have people who have more of these abilities, they tend to be more collectively intelligent. Another thing that shows up a lot in our studies is the importance of various forms of diversity. So we find that gender diversity enhances collective intelligence. Racial diversity does as well, in addition to cognitive style diversity, or these different ways of thinking that characterize people who work in different professional domains. So all of these things pretty consistently lead to collective intelligence in our studies. We've also known for a long time in social psychology and organizational psychology that goal setting and having clear, specific, challenging goals is important for individuals. It's also important for teams, but there's the additional difficulty of alignment, that team members' goals need to be congruent or hopefully mutually reinforcing, that as soon as individuals have a goal that conflicts with a team goal, the individual goal will win, that the team will not be as collectively intelligent. And then finally, communication shows up over and over again. There are some nuances to this, but the really robust finding is that the amount of communication and the relative equality of communication is important for collective intelligence. I went too fast there. That groups with more social intelligence also tend to exhibit these patterns more commonly. So this is how these things fit together. Having the right people leads to better coordination processes as well. So these building blocks are things that we've been looking at in a variety of different ways. And one thing more relevant to our topic today of remote work is that these show up in remote work settings as well. In our studies, teams that are working in a distributed environment are just as collectively intelligent as teams working together face-to-face. So there's nothing inherently better about being in person. But there are a few nuances that are worth mentioning. And so one relates to not only having the right people, so social intelligence just as important, even more important in some of our studies in remote settings, but in addition, where team members are located and how they're distributed ends up being important. So just to highlight this with an example, if you think about a distributed work environment that's configured in potentially 3 different ways. So you say you have 6 team members and they're either in 2 different locations or distributed across 3 locations or all fully dispersed. If you were to think to yourself about which of these configurations would be most problematic, where might we see the least trust or the most conflict? Well, a lot of times when I pose this question to classes that I'm teaching, people offer the intuition that the fully dispersed would be the most problematic. But in fact, what we see in studies is that it's really the configurations where you have some people co-located who are collaborating with people they are not co-located with. And so, some studies look at this in two subgroups. Two subgroups in particular is problematic because you get this intergroup relation thing where everything that's good is because of us and all the problems are because of them. But we are also seeing that even when you have some co-located and some dispersed, because the co-located people, again, sort of communicate with each other in different ways and coordinate with each other in different ways, and are more likely to forget, or there are more likely to be gaps in the communication with those who are not on site with them. And so that is where the hybrid piece becomes really difficult, because the means of coordination are different when groups are co-located versus remote or distributed. And so the group needs to pick a way to coordinate, and using the co-located approach does not work when you have distributed collaborators. And that's where we're seeing all the problems with hybrid work. So having alignment and goals, again, is also really important, but can be more difficult in remote work settings, because people may not be confirming as frequently, what are we still on track? Are we still trying to achieve the same objectives that we discussed? Everybody may not be on the same page. And then finally, with communication, as I mentioned, many of the same things that lead to high collective intelligence for face-to-face teams are also important in remote work. And so even when groups are communicating online or doing group chat, we find that this high level inequality of communication ends up being important. A final issue, and this is a very new study, but something that comes up a lot and we get asked a lot about, is building relationships. How is it that groups that are collaborating remotely could actually establish meaningful relationships? Well, it turns out that our studies and some others coming out in the literature really do support the conclusion that you can, but it requires that you build on what we already know about what is fundamental to establishing relationships in any setting, which is self-disclosure. So we did a study using individuals who were strangers online, and got them together and gave them questions to discuss. And we manipulated the tone and the content of the questions to try to create a different mood in different groups. So in some groups, we had more of a serious or maybe even sort of solemn mood in terms of asking people to talk about, what was the hardest thing that happened to you this past year, or things that could, get a little bit more somber, or we just let them talk about whatever they wanted to for the same amount of time. And what we found was that when we gave them our serious questions, people, first of all, engaged in much more self-disclosure. They tended to really talk about things that were important to them, even though they were free to answer the questions in any way they really wanted to. They did end up, revealing more personal information. There was also a lot more affiliation evident in their interactions, both in the tone of voice and in the words they used. And they exhibited much higher collective intelligence. We had them do our collective intelligence test after this introductory activity, and they were also more interested in working together in the future. By contrast, the people that we didn't give these questions to, first of all, they seemed happier. They were joking around a lot more. There was a lot more positive emotion, but lower levels of collective intelligence and much lower levels of affiliation and self-disclosure. People were very superficial in these interactions, even though they spoke for the same amount of time on whatever they wanted to. So what we take from this is that you can build relationships online, but it really requires a little more intentionality and focus, because if you think about the office environment, we might joke around for a long time, but eventually get around to talking about things that are real. And then the online environment, we just don't spend that many hours together. So it requires a little bit more nudging, if you will. So I'll stop there, but I just wanted to sort of seed these ideas in the conversation and see where it takes us.
Thanks, Anita. So I'm gonna. We've gotten many questions even before we started today. We still are receiving questions. I was doing a bit of filtering. By the way, I have my own kind of deep curiosities, but they're a bit more academic, and I'll save those to the end in case we have time. But like representing kind of our audience, I know that, so obviously all the questions had to do with either kind of remote or hybrid work, and as you kind of point out, these should be treated separately, I think. And so maybe let's start with just purely remote work. I mean, essentially, we had a lot of questions around the very human element of developing connections. Again, let's take just purely remote for a second. Phrases like feeling of belonging, establishing meaningful connections. You touched on some of this as far as communication is key there. I'm curious as to what the deeper questions that might induce that. Maybe just as a broad question. And you can answer this either from the perspective of individuals in a team or somebody managing a team. What are generic guidelines to establishing personal connections between members of a team in the context of purely remote work?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question. And there are a lot of different layers to the onion, if you will, when we talk about remote work, especially because it was introduced in so many organizations kind of, in this more emergency mode of COVID. And so a lot of organizations didn't get a chance to really be planful about it. But even if they did, I think there are some similar struggles. So backing up for just a moment, what we know in general about building relationships from the literature, I mentioned this importance of self-disclosure, and that really builds on some research that was initiated by Arthur Aaron in the 1980s and even before, a little before, where he brought couples into the lab and had them discuss different questions. And again, we were modeling our study off of his, giving people an opportunity to talk about things that are meaningful to them and, sort of over time, more and more engage in self-disclosure and in letting people get to know things about them that are really important. So that is a key piece of developing commitment to organizations, connections between individuals, whether face-to-face or remote. When we go to the remote environment, some organizations, especially when they had to make the sudden shift, simply took all of their ways of doing business face-to-face and just put it onto their favorite video conference platform. And that's where we've heard about people in, their meetings online all day long. And so even though organizations have tried to create social events online, nobody has the appetite for it, because they're just completely burned out by the end of the day of all these video calls. Some of the organizations that have really kind of leaned into this have done a few things. One is that they've created other ways to coordinate that don't require synchronous video-based meetings so that people have less of that in their day. And then they're making use of those synchronous conversations, whether on video or sometimes even, the occasional offsite or going to the office as the offsite, to specifically invest in mentoring, in professional development, in sort of culture building activities, whether it's with teams or with whole departments. And so when organizations sort of like create that space for that to happen and create the structures so that people can have real conversations, we do see that those relationships can be built even in a hybrid work environment. But it does require sort of a mental shift in terms of how we do our regular day-to-day coordination, as well as how we can kind of, if you will, scaffold these interactions so that, it doesn't take the hours and hours of running into each other in the coffee room before we talk about things that matter, but instead, maybe we have mentoring conversations that have some question prompts that we discuss that help us get to the heart of the issue more quickly.
So actually, you bring up a good, we talk about hybrid and remote right now. I mean, this is the hot button issue because we're kind of COVID, post-COVID. But you're a scientist and you're studying this. There were firms before COVID that were kind of fully remote, and there are firms that kind of became remote because of COVID. This must have established kind of the perfect kind of experimental, I guess, observational setup. Are there things that we've learned about? Because I was going to ask about firms that do this well and firms that don't do this well. It actually seems like we can kind of check this out directly from the data now. What are we seeing?
Yeah. And I mean, a lot of those studies are still underway also in terms of, how is it all going to pan out and who's going to remain remote, et cetera. But yeah, I mean, so telecommuting maybe was the old version of it. And then there were virtual teams, in the 1990s. There have been different forms of this for quite some time, and we've been researching it for quite some time. But to your point, Andrew, even before COVID, there were some organizations that were seeing that, for example, teams can be just as collectively intelligent if they're face-to-face or remote. And guess what? If we can work completely remotely, that frees up a lot of constraints around who we can recruit, how we can work together. We don't need to rent offices, whatever, pick your favorite outcome from that. So there are some organizations that started much more with the technology-oriented companies, especially those that were developing technology, so software development, for example, were among the early adopters, but it really has spread beyond that, well beyond that, professional service firms, all kinds of different industries now where organizations are finding ways to get their work done either completely remotely or mostly remotely. It does, though, require that you adopt, as I mentioned, different ways of organizing. And so one phrase that is used in some corners is remote first, meaning that we are organized so that we share information in the same way, whether we're in the office or not. And then that makes it possible for us to maybe not be in the office at all, or for us to have this hybrid approach, but not have the communication gaps that tend to form otherwise. It would mean instead of my just relying on letting you know something by walking down the hall and talking to you in your office, I'm letting you know we can have the conversation, but we're also capturing it in some way that it's available. If it's information that others need to know, it's available to them as well.
So you're hitting on kind of, it sounds like you mentioned earlier the big challenge is you had a picture which was teams aggregated in an abstract way versus kind of completely remote. If we move to kind of hybrid, right, and in the hybrid setting, for example, that creates two very obvious or an obvious division, right? There's those that are in office and those that are not. there are definitely new considerations. How do we think about, for example, maintaining the same level of collaboration, of communication? What are the guidelines, right? As far as clearly hybrid sounds like, in fact, the toughest to manage. How should we think about that?
Yeah, it really is the toughest to manage, because in some ways the companies that do it really well make it so that employees who are coming to the office probably feel like there are fewer benefits to coming to the office because they're still doing things the same way that they would do them if they were working, from home. But basically, so I'll talk about, there are some organizations that go all the way out to the extent of, if we were having a video conference, even if we're in the building together, we are still connecting from our own computer with our own video camera and our own microphone, so that you don't have that horrible situation that I think I've never heard anyone say they think this is a great situation, where you've got the people in the room with the one camera and then, people remote who are, trying to hear or see or whatever, understand what's going on. Like that is, and I know that there are a lot of technological solutions being proposed for those situations, but even so, even if you had great technology, there still ends up being, some exchanges that happen in the room that might be important to the coordination of the project, but then don't get transmitted to everybody who isn't in the room. So many of those organizations try to kind of make it so that the information flow is equally facilitated among all of the participants. And similarly, that there are project tracking and, systems in place so that the details of meetings, of decisions, of conversations are all captured in such a way that people who are not on site can have access to them as well. And so, you do hear about people going into the office and they're like, okay, well, if I'm in my office, but I'm just on, video conference all day with all these different people, what's the point in coming? And that's actually sort of a valid question in some of these settings, and does, kind of call into question some of what we're hearing. And I even see some comments in the questions online here about, policies that different organizations are contemplating now about, well, do we just kind of say 3 days a week, everyone comes in, et cetera. And I would say, another point about hybrid is the fact that a lot of organizations use that term differently. So sometimes hybrid means sometimes I'm in the office, sometimes I'm at home. It can also mean some people are in the office, some people are at home. And it can mean sometimes some people are in the office and are at home at different times. But all of those create, slightly different variations in these coordination issues, but they're all challenging. More challenging than just fully remote.
So in fact, like along these same lines, we had a good question live now, which is that, even hybrid, which, I went into this as there's remote, hybrid, and kind of in person, but even hybrid, the way you would draw those divisions could be, for example, by time zone, and that kind of establishes by nature draws cultural lines. How do we think of hybrid, which is hybrid, same time zone, but split by, for example, whether you use the stage in your life, versus hybrid because of time zone. Does this play a?
Yeah, well, there can be, I briefly mentioned this idea of fault lines when I was just giving my overview. And so there's been a lot of work on this notion of fault lines, which is where, you have a group that kind of splinters into subgroups because those subgroups kind of have some characteristics in common with each other that differentiate them from another group. And so some have been worried that hybrid could enhance this because, say, for example, it's the working moms who all decide to be remote. And so all of a sudden you kind of have this different status in the organization, or maybe there would be certain job functions that had the privilege of being remote, or certain job functions where, okay, we're not going to give you an office, so you're going to be remote. So that's lower status. So you've all of these things that can go on in these various hybrid arrangements that could be problematic. But when you talk about time zone, that adds yet another layer to this, which is synchronous versus asynchronous. And so I think the organizations that have, taken this on in the most sophisticated way and are really benefiting, I'd say, from the flexibility, are those that are not only remote, but have also figured out how to do more things asynchronously, because then time zone doesn't matter, right? And then actually, if you're having a meeting and a conversation about a decision, it doesn't matter who's available on Wednesday at 2, because you can get input from everybody, because there are systems in place to do that, because that's how the organization does its work. And so I tend to, really convey and actually based on the data, convey an optimistic picture of what really remote asynchronous work can be like, because of all the ways that it can free up organizations and employees to live where they want to work where they want to, and to have more flexibility to juggle all of the different things that might be in their life. So I think there are a lot of possibilities, but it does require shifting mindset around how you coordinate, how you do work.
So I think now is there's kind of the big question that's been asked in 3 or 4 different ways. And this, I'll phrase it, I think, in the proper way. So that the question is essentially between, how about corporate productivity as a function of in-person, hybrid, or remote? All I'll say is, what does research, is there any research pointing to an answer? What does it point to? Is there an answer to the question, is in-person versus hybrid versus remote more or less or equally productive?
Yeah. Well, I mean, you've been around academia enough to know there's always dueling data sets on every question, right? But I would say, not only the preponderance of the evidence points to a productivity benefit to remote work. The debates come around, okay, what are we measuring, or what is that based on? Is it that people are working more hours, but they're not actually more productive? Is it just that they don't have the commute time? What is it that's really driving the productivity? But even some of the studies that try to, parse all of that out still say, well, people don't have the interruptions. They're in, especially if they're not in an organization that is keeping them on video conference all day long, they're having more uninterrupted time. And we know how problematic that is for productivity. And so on balance, workers are demanding it. I mean, I've not seen a survey in the last 3 years that hasn't said the vast majority of workers want some form of hybrid or remote work. And, they're demanding it, and it seems to be beneficial in most of the studies. Hybrid work, again, because of all the different permutations, has more mixed evidence, especially, and I experienced this even myself, if you're in the office, if you're in one office sometimes and in another office another time, maybe other people are more organized, but almost always something I need is not where I am, or, I'm in the office when my collaborator isn't. And so, we're trying to shift back and forth how exactly we're coordinating. And so hybrid has more of these sort of, these wrinkles that maybe take away from the productivity of remote work.
So this is the awesome answer. Like, nearly complete ranking of so I mean, I find this surprising, right? So remote we're measuring corporate productivity. Remote is number 1, or I should say remote dominates the other 2. Mm-hmm. And hybrid was the worst of the 3.
in many of the estimates I've seen, because in fully remote work, I mean, the other thing I didn't mention that we didn't talk about is also the reduced expenses that the organization has. So if you're really looking at organizational productivity, the organization doesn't really benefit until they really go almost completely remote. Because when you have hybrid, especially the 3 days a week, everybody comes in, you're still maintaining all of the infrastructure to have everybody come all the time. But then you have some of the coordination issues of the shifting back and forth. So most studies I've seen have said that the hybrid is actually the worst.
So can I push on I'm gonna sorry to the
sure,
audience.
push.
I'm gonna ask
You're the operations guy, right?
I'm gonna take an academic lens, that is, not push on the claims here. From the academic, so I would have two kind of related questions. One is, how do these studies go about measuring general productivity? And maybe related is, can we tie this back to some of the principles you gave, like very kind of concrete, well-proven principles that apply to kind of collective intelligence? Mm-hmm. Is there a link between kind of the conclusion that you described and those principles?
Yes. Yeah. So the studies that look at productivity have come at it from a whole variety of different angles. And actually, some of these studies originate even before, pandemic. So Nicholas Bloom out at Stanford is somebody who's done a lot of the widely read studies looking at in one organization, it was in China, where workers were randomly assigned to work remotely or not. They had a variety of gauges of productivity, both, metrics from, systems in the organization, looking at actual production, looking at number of hours worked, workers self-report, et cetera, all pointed to advantages to remote work in that setting. There aren't a lot of studies that can rise up to the level of a randomized field experiment at that level, but others that have come subsequently and often during pandemic, you try to derive similar measures, trying to discount some of the alternative explanations around simply it's more hours worked and other kinds of things that have complicated the conclusions. And then also looking at workers' own, self-reports of sort of the quality of what they feel they're producing, given a number of hours worked. So, which is important, especially when you're talking about knowledge work environments, and also when we're in a tight labor market, and people might be inclined to move into a work arrangement that they feel like they're being more productive in. So, I don't know if that provides you all the data you want on probably not, but I can send you some papers on that also. So then your second, so tying this back to the collective intelligence factors. So we also see in those environments, and this has been something that's been a focus even from the commuting and virtual team days of 20 years ago, that there are certain workers who actually also do better in these settings, and their teams do better in these settings. And they are those who have the characteristics that also facilitate collective intelligence. And so things that are related to social intelligence, perspective taking, communication skills, self-management skills. It definitely, remote work, anybody who's done it knows that, you definitely need to have a certain amount of, personal self-discipline, as well as to be proactive in communication. So those things have come out across all of our studies, and also in the remote work setting. The coordination piece, I think we've talked about a bit as well, which is having the right systems in place to coordinate the inputs, and depending on how interdependently the workers are the projects are that they're working on might require different sorts of systems. But, we've seen actually fairly collaboratively intensive work products being produced by organizations that are doing product development, for example, completely remotely. So definitely the same systems we see that facilitate collective intelligence work there. And that all together also binds together, the goal setting and the priorities. And so if those are, also clear and aligned, and they will be if the right collaboration systems are there, and if you've got the people who are asking questions when they're not sure, then all the pieces kind of come together to support the system.
Let me ask one more question on just the formatting, right? Remote versus hybrid. So I guess there are a large subset of us that are stuck in a hybrid environment. What is this is the kind of the how to get ahead kind of question, right? If you're kind of stuck in a hybrid situation, and you're kind of like, now as individual, I'm going to zoom out later and get back to management, but as individual in, let's say, what is we've established is kind of the on average the worst of the three environments. Are there ways to think about leveraging our understanding of team building, collective intelligence to I don't know, what are things to avoid, behaviors to avoid, activities to promote, right? So for example, I really like the study you pointed to that was building bonds via kind of tough questions. This sounds hard to operationalize, right?
Yeah, although I think that in organizations that find ways to not make everybody be on meetings all day, so that they can ideally free up some time for more of the mentoring and personal development conversations. Some organizations that are really serious about those will set up mentoring relationships and maybe even have, on a quarterly basis, a focus to what the mentoring conversation should be about. So they might provide, discussion guides or things that the mentor and mentee are doing that in essence are kind of what we were doing with our strangers online. It's sort of like, okay, kind of giving people permission to talk about what they're struggling with, and what they need help with, providing resources to address those things, and a variety of, variations on that. You're seeing more like reciprocity rings, for example, popularized by Adam Grant's Give and Take book, where people are, reaching out and asking for what they need and providing that to each other. And so I think that a critical piece is to give people some flexibility and time to be able to do that. So it requires, kind of rethinking, restructuring the workday, so that it's not all just taken up with meetings, and prioritizing these other activities that maybe some organizations were depending on happening, organically when people are in the office. But we all know that there was wide variation to the degree that that was happening, and that was its own problem. Well, maybe that can be corrected by doing it in a more intentional way in the hybrid environment. And I think this comes to, I've noticed some of the questions here about culture, building culture, organizational culture. And relatedly, a point I make when in these conversations is you can absolutely build organizational culture in a remote environment or hybrid environment, because organizational culture is just based on what are the things that we are really about as an organization that we value, and how do we infuse these into all of our key activities, when we hire, when we mentor people, the basis on which we reward people, we promote people, et cetera, communicating those and reinforcing them through the various ways that you provide professional development and support to employees. And that can absolutely be done in a remote environment.
So I'm going to switch gears now just to, I guess, broader questions that don't necessarily have to do with, again, the format of workplace. I mean, ultimately, your research is studying kind of teams and what makes teams work well and what makes teams not work well. But a broad question, which is just what are general guidelines for forming teams? You pointed to some diversity, racial are beneficial. You pointed to another that had to do with there was a picture of eyeballs, and it had seemed like it had to do with something related to social cognition or something.
Yes.
Yeah, or perceptiveness. Yes. I guess yes. That one felt a bit harder to apply. How do we think how does a manager think about putting teams?
Well, and I mean, you're kind of taking me back to my roots here, because when I started studying teamwork and collaboration, it was in a more traditional environment. And I think a lot of what our research has surfaced over and over again is that a lot of times when people think about managing teams, they think about what's happening when everybody's sitting around the table and how maybe a dynamic leader could say the right things and motivate people and so on. And that can be useful and positive, but there's a lot of groundwork that is done in how the team is designed and composed to begin with, right? So you're putting together your team, you're thinking about who is going to be on the team, and so this thing with the eyeballs, with the social perceptiveness, that's an item from a test that we use in some of our studies, where people are supposed to draw inferences about what the person in the picture is thinking or feeling. That's what that's from. And people who do that more accurately tend to have higher social intelligence in other ways as well. And so when you're composing your team, while we found that having intellectually smart people was not quite enough, if you have the skills and abilities together with those collaboration abilities, your team will be, much more productive. So I often tell people, if you have the choice between the world's expert in something, or you could choose somebody who's way above threshold, but also a really good collaborator, I would go with a good collaborator, because we know from lots and lots of studies now that simply the world's expert may not be enough to create a smart group. So the people, the diversity piece comes in a lot of different ways, mostly because when we're in a more diverse group, everybody tends to think more carefully about the information being discussed and tends to be more attentive to things than when we're just hanging around with our buddies who are all like us, and we're kind of maybe not thinking as carefully about all of what's in front of us. So the people, the goal setting is important regardless. And then the coordination piece, and what we see in organizations right now, remote or face-to-face, is when teams are composed of people who are so busy because they're on 12 other teams that the team can't even have a meeting, then the team is sort of doomed from the start, right? And so setting up a team so that it can coordinate, people are available, they have the resources and capability to coordinate in the ways that they need to. You have people who are able to be good collaborators, and the group is aligned around some clear goals. That's the fundamental basis. And a lot of those basic foundational pieces can be put in place before a team even really convenes, if you think about it. And they all extend to the hybrid and remote work setting.
So just earlier when you mentioned kind of this idea that there's, you're selecting between a teammate that's whatever kind of the highest on the intelligence scale, there's somebody where you might trade off intelligence for collaboration, you said. How was the idea that some of the things you're measuring, the social perceptiveness, other things, are kind of proxies for that collaboration? Because that sounds very tough to measure, right? But
Yeah. No, so so at the foundation of the ability to collaborate are some skills. And the key one that we have measured in our studies is social perceptiveness as a very specific skill within the broader set of social intelligence abilities. But that's the one that can be most reliably measured and is highly correlated with many. So there's perceiving cues, there's communicating effectively using those cues, there's using that information to manage collaboration. And so people who are strong in one area tend to be strong in the others. And so we measure the thing that we can most reliably capture. But then the other piece is also correlated is communication ability. So when you put these together, when we say collaboration ability, it's a composite of those things, right? And they tend to be important in any of these collaboration environments.
Okay, so one last question to the audience. I apologize, this is for me. Where's the research going? What's something you're thinking about? What's a question you have right now that 5 years from now we might have the answer to?
I know. Well, so a lot of focus right now on technology and artificial intelligence. So are there ways that we could build in smarter agents that would help facilitate the collaboration of a team that is struggling? Either maybe it's a hybrid environment and I am not realizing that so-and-so who's remote didn't get the information that we just discussed. And so maybe there's, something prompting us to keep that in mind, or picking up on the fact that, okay, in this conversation, Anita's been doing a lot of talking, and we know that, more equal communication is better. So maybe we should sort of, give her some subtle hints, maybe privately, to, rein it in a little bit, et cetera. So which of those things is going to really make the biggest difference, and how they'll be integrated and what role they'll play? But there's a lot of different efforts along those lines, trying to figure out how basically technology might facilitate us.
Thanks, Anita. So this let me kind of stop our conversation here, to the extent possible. Let's Anita, thanks so much.
My pleasure.
Let me so before I turn it back over to John, let me just I get a second. Let me just give my a brief explanation for the logo to my top right. This has been kind of a joint event between Tepper and Enable. Enable is actually so we are a joint effort between Tepper, the School of Computer Science, and the School of Fine Arts, which is specific to kind of AI and design as applied to specifically retail and services. Among our other activities, one is we host a monthly event. This kind of served as our September event, and we'll do one kind of every month going forward. Our next one is end of October, covering the topic of robotics in retail, and a nice discussion around that. If you want to join our mailing list, or you want to consider becoming a sponsor, there's an email on the slide that you're seeing bottom left. That's Chris Kissel, right? And you can just email enable, ENAIBLE @cmu.edu. I encourage you to reach out. We've got plenty of activities. I should thank our sponsor for this year, Home Depot. And I guess that's it for me. Thanks to everyone for joining. I'm going to turn it back over now to John to close the event. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Woolley and Professor Lee. It's an outstanding discussion today on, I think, on a topic that we're all very interested in. I know a lot of alumni will be watching this on YouTube a little bit later to get the insights from today. If alumni want to reach out to you, encourage them to go to the Tepper website. The faculty website is there, and our faculty love to hear from practitioners out in the field, and especially our alumni who are out working, and questions that you might have. And they like to answer those questions, or that sometimes provides an opportunity for great research. So I want to thank Professor Chris Kissel too as well, and for the collaboration with Enable and the good work that they're doing across campus. If you have ideas for future webinars, topics you'd like to see us address, faculty you'd like to hear from, please let us know. We look forward to that. And we hope that we'll see you next week on October 6th for our next discussion with our dean and 3 of our faculty members. So thank you for joining us today and for being part of our very active alumni community at Carnegie Mellon University and at the Tepper School.